Is the 6.0 PowerStroke better than the 5.9 Cummins? Absolutely not. But we're gonna go ahead and talk about them and compare the two of them anyways. If you're looking for an early to mid 2000s diesel, you might be deciding between the 6.0 and the 5.9 Cummins. So we're gonna go ahead and walk you through some of the different considerations here, predominantly from a reliability standpoint, as well as from a performance and performance potential standpoint. Let's get started off by saying the 5.9 Cummins is widely considered to be one of the most reliable diesel engines, whereas the 6.0 PowerStroke is probably considered one of the least reliable modern diesel engines. So there's not a huge matchup between these two engines, but they were produced at the same time. And so there are a lot of people that might be wondering what the differences are between the two and considering maybe picking up a cheaper 6.0 PowerStroke instead of spending a little bit more for a 5.9 Cummins. Since the 6.0 PowerStroke came out in 2003, we're going to be comparing the 6.0 PowerStroke against the 5.9 Cummins 24 valve from 2003 to 2007. Now, before jumping into reliability, there is one other thing worth mentioning here. The 6.0 PowerStroke replaced the 7.3 because of emissions regulations. So alongside that, the 6.0 PowerStroke got exhaust gas recirculation. Now, the 5.9 Cummins, on the other hand, was extremely good from an emissions standpoint, and therefore it didn't have any emissions equipment up until 2004 and a half when they added a catalytic converter. However, with just a catalytic converter, they were able to pass emissions requirements, and so no 5.9 Cummins has EGR or any of the other emissions related systems. And as we'll get into, EGR is a huge problem on the 6.0 PowerStroke. It's not even a factor in the 5.9s because it didn't even have it. So now comparing the two engines from a reliability standpoint, first, let's start with the 5.9 Cummins. By 2003, the majority of the problems with this engine were already addressed. It had issues with the VP44 injection pump, but that was fixed now with the CP3. It did have a number of issues with the fuel injectors, which continued on all the way through 2007. The fuel injectors do tend to leak once they get around the 150 to 200,000 mile mark, and so that is a frequent maintenance item that you'll have to keep in mind, and injectors run about $1,000 on the 5.9 Cummins. And another fueling component that the 5.9 Cummins does tend to have a problem with is with the lift pump. The 2003 and 2004 models have frequent lift pump failure. However, that was fixed in 2005 onwards. So outside of your fuel injectors and the lift pump, the only other problem is cracked exhaust manifolds. The 5.9 Cummins is an inline 6, and so the exhaust manifold is very long, and just with the heat tolerances, it tends to crack from time to time. The exhaust manifold is about a $500 problem. So that's really it for the 5.9 Cummins from 2003 to 2007. A couple years have lift pump problems. Injectors are going to be a maintenance item, and then you might crack an exhaust manifold, especially if you add some performance modifications. But overall, there are very few problems with this engine, and really not any that give us any long-term reliability concerns with the engine. Moving over to the 6.0 PowerStroke, these engines were plagued with problems, both with emissions equipment as well as with a couple other components of the engine. So jumping into it, it had issues with the high-pressure oil pump or the high-pressure oil system. That's caused by the oil pump failure. It could also be caused by the ICP sensor or the IPR valve, which are also frequent failure items. You've got EGR cooler issues, EGR valve issues. You have oil cooler failure, issues with the fuel injector control module failing. The fuel injectors are also problematic. The turbochargers are known to be unreliable, and the cylinder heads have a lot of problems, especially when power is added. So when we compare these two from a reliability standpoint, the 6.0 PowerStroke isn't even anywhere close to being in the ballpark as the 5.9 from a reliability standpoint. That's it from a reliability standpoint. If you're looking for a reliable diesel that you don't need to sink a bunch of money into with maintenance and problems, get the 5.9. Now, the one caveat that I will mention is there is a such thing as bulletproofing a 6.0 PowerStroke, which we're going to do a full video on at a later date. But bulletproofing it is essentially going through and addressing all of the weak points in the engine and fixing all of the common problems that might occur, replacing the high pressure oil pump, upgrading the EGR cooler, and so on and so forth to prevent any of these common problems. A bulletproof 6.0 PowerStroke is not a bad buy. At least all of the money has already been spent on bulletproofing it, and they will be significantly more reliable, but I don't care. It doesn't matter if it's bulletproofed. It's still not going to compete with a 5.9 from a reliability standpoint. Moving into performance now, one, from the factory, they're really very comparable. The 6.0 produced 325 horsepower and anywhere from 560 to 570 torque, whereas the 5.9 Cummins produced 305 to 325 horsepower and 555 to 610 torque. So very similar power numbers from the factory, but of course, these are diesel engines and people like to modify and upgrade them. So we're gonna go ahead and mostly talk about performance potential with these engines. So looking at the 5.9 Cummins, the factory block, the heads, the internals are all good for about 700 to 800 wheel horsepower before you have to look at starting to make some significant internal upgrades. So they're very strong engines overall. The transmission is the biggest weak point on these engines. The transmission's only good for about 400 wheel horsepower before you're going to need to start making some upgrades and modifications to it. That's going to be the first hurdle that you hit with this engine, especially considering 400 wheel horsepower and 800 wheel torque can be made with just a couple simple bolt-on modifications. Additionally, your fuel system is good for about 500 wheel horsepower before you're going to need to look at potentially upgrading the CP3 or adding larger fuel injectors. And the turbocharger is good for about 500 wheel horsepower as well on 2005 plus models. The 2003 and 2004 models have a slightly smaller turbocharger, which is going to be good for about 450 wheel horsepower. So what you can do with these engines is add tuning, and I'd recommend adding transmission tuning because 400 wheel horsepower is really pushing it on this transmission. Add a lift pump because the lift pump is known to fail. Even on the later models, an upgraded lift pump will help a lot. Drop an intake on it, throw an exhaust system on it, and you can be looking at a very reliable 400 wheel horsepower, 800 wheel torque 5.9 Cummins. Now, jumping into the 6.0 PowerStroke, the block and the internals are also very strong. They can handle into the 700s in terms of wheel horsepower. However, the biggest problem is with the heads, the head gaskets as well. So the heads crack frequently, the head gaskets do tend to blow. You can remedy this with some good ARP head studs, but even with ARP head studs, if you push the power just a little bit too much, it's pretty easy to crack the heads on it. That is kind of a big inhibitor to performance potential for these engines, is you might need to look at upgrading your head to be able to handle certain power levels. At a minimum, you're definitely going to need to add head studs. So other components here, the stock turbo can handle about 450 wheel horsepower. The stock injectors are probably the weak point from a fueling standpoint. You'll need to upgrade those pretty on and get larger injectors around 425 wheel horsepower. But the good thing with the 6.0 PowerStroke is that the transmission is significantly stronger than it is in the 5.9 Cummins. The transmission can handle about 500 wheel horsepower before you need to start looking at upgrading it. Now, of course, doing transmission tuning before then is highly recommended and a great way to protect your transmission, but it's good for about 500 before you need to start putting money into it, which is a whole extra 100 horsepower over the 5.9 Cummins. But the caveat is you cannot reach that 500 wheel horsepower level without upgrading the turbo, upgrading your injectors, and really making sure you're locking down the head and the head gasket with some really good ARP head studs. So ultimately, from a performance potential standpoint, the engine block and the internals can handle about the same amount of horsepower. Now, the heads on the 5.9 aren't an issue. Head studs are never a bad idea anyways, but they're definitely required on the 6.0 because the head is an issue. And then when we look at the other components, The 5.9 Cummins has a stronger turbocharger in the 2005 Plus models, and it has a stronger fueling system. The only leg up the 6.0 really has is the transmission, and the fact that the transmission can hold an extra 100 horsepower over the 5.9 Cummins. From a performance potential standpoint, the 5.9 is still going to win this one. The factory components can hold up under a good bit more power with the exception of the transmission, but it also doesn't have the issue with the heads and the head gaskets that the 6.0 has. Furthermore, if you're going to buy a fresh 6.0 and throw a bunch of modifications on it, you're going to run into a ton of problems if you don't bulletproof the thing first. That's kind of a big consideration when I look at performance potential, because you can go and buy a 5.9 Cummins, throw $1,000 of modifications on it, and now you're at 400 wheel horsepower and 800 wheel torque. $1,000 on top of what you pay for the truck, and there you are. But if you want to go ahead and buy the 6.0, now you're looking at spending $3,000 to $4,000 to bulletproof it, and then spending another $1,000 on modifications just to get to the same power levels that you're getting on the 5.9 Cummins. I never would recommend trying to modify the 6.0 PowerStroke until it's been bulletproofed. Otherwise, you're asking for running into some serious engine problems. So at the end of the day, because of those factors, I'm giving it to the 5.9 from a performance standpoint as well. Now, the one thing to take into account is because the 5.9 is such a better engine, those vehicles are a little bit more expensive than the PowerStrokes. Depending on what truck it is, what condition it's in, a 5.9 Cummins might be anywhere from $4,000 to $7,000 more expensive than a PowerStroke. But in my mind, that is a better decision any day of the week. Yes, you can buy the 6.0 PowerStroke and bulletproof it and probably be the same amount of money into the truck as a Cummins, because the Cummins are a little bit more expensive. But like I mentioned earlier, a bulletproof 6.0 is still not going to be anywhere near reliable as a 5.9 Cummins, and I prefer the 5.9 Cummins from a performance standpoint as well. Anyways, guys, like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, the 6.0 PowerStroke definitely isn't better than the 5.9 Cummins. The 5.9 Cummins is superior from a reliability standpoint, from a performance standpoint, and overall is the engine that I would take any day of the week over the 6.0 PowerStroke. Both of these vehicles were made from 2003 to 2007, and so it is a valid comparison to make, even though the 6.0 doesn't quite stack up. I would recommend looking a little bit older and getting a 7.3 PowerStroke if you are considering a 6.0. I hope you appreciated this video. If you like this content, please subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for more diesel content. We're going to piss off some 6.0 PowerStroke folks.